The best weekend in the AFL is here. Prelim final weekend. And I'll tell you what, if it's going to live up to its name or its reputation, it'll need to be good because the semi-finals were absolutely incredible. We'll talk about those shortly. Brisbane, who we'll get to as well, they'll arrive in Melbourne to tackle the Cats. We saw that contest 2 years ago as Geelong were marching toward a premiership, whilst the weekend kicks off with the number one seeded Sydney Swans, who are rested and refreshed against the gritty, tenacious Port Adelaide Football Club. But before we dig into those two big contests and work out who'll be playing in the 2024 AFL Grand Final, we need to go back because, as I said off the top, it was an epic weekend, an unbelievable weekend of footy, two hotly contested games, two thrilling results, and two teams who survive and advance, which is the name of the game, and two teams who are sent packing. Also around the AFL, trade talk is starting to ramp right up. Zach Merritt's name came up, and then it was squashed just as quickly. After a pretty ho-hum trade period last year, it looks like this year's version is going to be busier and involving much more or many more high-profile names all over the place. So looking forward to that. Speaking of moving places, Dustin Martin seemingly wants to be a Gold Coast Sun. The whispers had been there all year. David Schwartz and Sam McClure, among others, were saying Dusty will be a Gold Coast Sun next season. He did the retirement thing at Richmond. He spoke passionately and from the heart about his time as a Tiger. Brendan Gale at the press conference that Dustin wasn't at told us he'd retired, to his knowledge, but the whispers are there. So we shall see. And what's he worth? We'll talk about whether the move makes sense, not necessarily from Dusty's perspective, but maybe from Gold Coast perspective, because they are on the path to their maiden finals appearance. Joe Daniher and the Lions, they're on the agenda. They're on the agenda. I picked them to win the whole thing at the start of the year on the back of their 2023 campaign where they were close enough to premiers without being premiers. They were a kick away, maybe a poor umpiring decision away from doing so. And some of the individuals involved in the Brisbane Lions Football Club deserve some love. Joe Daniher's one. The coach, Chris Fagan's another. Not the backhanded love most are giving some of these guys. And we'll pick the two games. We'll preview the two games as well on the Field AFL. Thanks to those who have been watching and engaging. And as the great American sportscaster / personality Pat McAfee likes to say, be a friend and tell a friend. Make sure you do subscribe and get involved. I love the engagement. Love talking footy with all in sundry. Now, Dustin Martin, let's start there because it was a big story when it dropped on Friday afternoon. I was on radio or preparing for radio at the time. And I was pretty surprised once we finally got to air. We talked about the topic. We threw it around. We talked about the pros and cons. And so many of the talkback callers were quite negative toward Dustin Martin, very negative toward Damien Hardwick. This is largely Richmond fans I'm speaking of. But just whether there'd been too much work in the background behind the sight screens, if you will. A little bit of Travis Cloak areas there, some talk and some smoke screens behind the windows, whatever he had to say for himself way back when. But most fans were wondering, has there been too much done without the knowledge or without the total truth being told to Richmond fans? So of course Damien Hardwick came out and said he was worn out, he was burnt out, he needed a spell, and then only a handful of weeks later was announced as the Gold Coast coach. And some, if you believe the whispers, believe Dustin Martin was going to become a Gold Coast Sun many, many months ago. So I'm not sure what you want to believe. I don't think it matters that much when you've got 3 premierships in your back pocket, as both those men do. I mean, you can get away with a bit more. I think you can get away with a bit on the back end. So the interesting part for me was Kel Twomey from the AFL.com.au platform said Dustin Martin's camp reached out to the Suns, which I find interesting. You don't hear about that often. Now, does he fit? Does he fit Gold Coast? I'm going to presume, I'll give you a number. I'm going to presume he was 75% bit/invested this year. Life in the forward half of a team that wins 2 games is difficult, even when you're at your peak. But Dusty managed 17 disposals per game. And to me, that number's the key. If he can average 15 or more as a Sun, playing in the front half of the ground, he'll make an impact because his ball use and creativity is such that he'll make others' jobs a lot easier. Gold Coast don't have a lot of great kicks in their team. I don't really know if they've got any outstanding kicks in their team. Dustin Martin is an outstanding kick. Forget about the tackling and chasing. Damien Hardwick and his coaching team will work that out. Others will do those jobs. But I like the move. I'm not worried about the coin. Money is the money. The Suns can work it out. Whatever they can afford to pay him, they'll pay him. And if it's too much, they just move along and they won't get the deal done. But if he signs for $1.2 million over 2 years, and he struggles and he doesn't get the job done, you can walk away from that contract 12 to 18 months later. Or you can write a check at the end of 12 months and be done with it. I think it's a risk worth taking. I like the move. I'm not saying it'll succeed, but I'm all for Dustin Martin to the Gold Coast Suns. Now, Hawthorn, one team who were eliminated last weekend in their semi-final against Port. I think they got run over a little bit. I don't think they believed what most of us thought, that they just win the game and potentially win it easily. That's certainly what I thought. But I think they just got their feathers ruffled a little. Port just brought the heat relentlessly. And Hawthorn were never able to get their ball movement going, their speed going. They were never able to feel comfortable at Adelaide Oval. And life for them changes now, because life as a part of a chasing pack, it's good living. Life without expectation is a blessed life. It's a great time to be alive. And that's the life the Hawks lived and led throughout 2024. But that time has passed. Almost as soon as James Sicily's 55-metre bomb grazed the left-hand goalpost at the river end of Adelaide Oval, Hawthorn's season was done there and then. And their focus shifts quickly to season 2025, only after the confrontation with Kenny. But next season, the Hawks will cop a top 6 fixture. They'll be on primetime TV, you've got to think, at least a handful of times. And they'll add Josh Battle and Tom Barras to the defensive stocks. Expectation will be sky high for the Hawks. There might be some, I reckon there will be some who pick them to win the premiership next preseason. But life with expectation is far more difficult. It'll be fun to see how the Hawks handle it, because it is an added burden. Will they be the same high-flying Hawks, high-rolling Hawks, the Hollywood Hawks? Will they just tighten the buckle a little bit? Will they tighten things up just a little bit? Will Sam Mitchell say, we are a part of the hunted now. We're not hunting everyone else. They're going to hunt us. So let's just tighten everything down. Let's just tighten the screws and make life a little bit easier for ourselves. It'll be fascinating to follow them moving into 2025. Now, Joe Daniher, the big man, the cure and the curse, I heard my man Dwayne Russell call him. Good Joe, bad Joe. I see that written all the time. So many descriptions of a player who I think has been truly elite at his position as a key forward who goes into the ruck since moving to Brisbane, and at times before moving to Brisbane. I'm not dismissing the fact that he can blaze away at goal on occasion, perhaps miss a teammate who's in a bit of space. I'm not saying it's weird or not weird to see him almost never celebrate a goal, and the fact that he can, like most of his teammates and most players in the AFL and in the world, can occasionally spray the easy one, yet drill the difficult one. But Joe Daniher is far, far more good than he is bad. It's not even a contest. And the evidence of that was on display last September, and it's on display again this September. He took a couple of big-time grabs against one of the best or the best individual tall defender in the competition in Sam Taylor. You can see on the vision, the early body work, the understanding of the drop zone, his ability to get up off one foot and reach up at the ball so that Taylor couldn't be involved in the contest. And the finish in that moment, I've got no doubt that he's thinking to himself, or you could be forgiven for thinking to yourself, if I do miss, it's still going to be a draw. We'll still have a chance to win this game. But he went back and drilled it. He went back and absolutely drilled it. I thought Daniher's September last year was superb. Thought he was among Brisbane's best 2 or 3 players. I thought he was their best player on grand final day. And as I said, he's replicating that here in this finals. He's got 6 goals through Brisbane's 2 finals. It doesn't look like the Cats have got a great matchup for him. I'm not sure they'll bring Sam De Koning in. Jack Henry gives away a lot of size. Jake Kolodjasny gives away even more. Mark Blitzovs, does he stay in defence? We'll talk about that a little bit later. Speaking of the weekend, let's start with the first of the prelims. Port Adelaide travelling to Sydney. Now, this is strange because the whole world is going to tip Sydney. Unless you live in Alberton or some parts of Adelaide, the whole world's going to tip Sydney. But have a listen to this. Port have beaten Sydney the last 8 times they've played. The past 8 times they've squared off, Port have won. Whether it's been in Adelaide or Sydney, hasn't mattered. And only 5 weeks ago, the Power hammered Sydney by 112 points. 112 points. But having said all that, I can't see much of that mattering in this game. I think the Swans will get it done because Sydney are refreshed, they're ready, and they're full of confidence. They know their best footy is back beneath them. Their last quarter against the Giants had to be seen to be believed. Of course, Isaac Heaney was huge. Brodie Grundy back running atop the ground. Tom Papley's back. And important for him to get himself back for that game, but then have a week off. That would be huge for him. He should be good to go. James Rowbottom can be used around the footy, whether it's an Ollie Wines who gets off the chain, whether it's Torn Francis, Rosie, Butters. And I think that is the reason why Sydney can get the job done. Neither team has a potent forward line. Both teams have solid enough defensive groups, great young players. But Port Adelaide's strength and Sydney's strength, the midfield, I give the edge to Sydney. For a start, you've got Goulden on a wing, who I think Port Adelaide will go after. I'm not sure who with, but I've got no doubt they'll go after him. Physically, Ken Hinkley loves to do that. But you put the names on a piece of paper. And I understand the game's not played on paper. It's played on grass. But you go Grundy, Heaney, Warner, a little bit of Papley, Rowbottom, and Goulden. And then you match that up. You marry that up with Sweet, Horn Francis, Butters, a banged up Butters, Rosie, Willem Drew, and Ollie Wines. I give the edge to Sydney. So you give the edge to Sydney around the ball. I'm not saying that's how it's going to play out, but on paper, you add in the fact you're in Sydney, the Swans are refreshed and they're rested. And this is, I think, the most valid part of it all. There has to be an emotional letdown for Port Adelaide. There has to be an emotional come down from that game. All of the build-up in Adelaide. This is going to be Ken Hinkley's last game. If they lose to Hawthorn, which most expected them to do, that would be it. Ken Hinkley would be sacked by Monday. They got themselves up for that game. The emotion was obvious to all. The energy was high and sustained for 120 minutes. Now you go on the road to a foreign or a less friendly environment, and you have to try and replicate that energy. You may need to even bring more energy to get it done against the Swans, and you may need to be able to fend off the energy of the Sydney crowd when it goes against you, just as Hawthorn failed to do when the Port crowd was in their face. That's the biggest element. I just wonder, and I doubt, to be honest, whether Port can replicate that level of pressure and intensity and sustain it for that long. Could they bring it for 50 minutes of the first half? Could they bring it for 50 minutes of the second half? Maybe. But we've seen this Sydney team all year when challenged, and when the other team drops off or Sydney's able to find the extra gear, that's where the separation comes. And I think that's what will happen in this game. I've got the Swans winning by 28 points. I think it'll be close for the most part. Sydney will be in control almost all night, maybe a 2 or 3 goal margin, and then they'll kick away late in that contest. Now, 24 hours later or less than, it is a rematch of the 2022 AFL preliminary final at the same venue, Brisbane and Geelong. Now, Brisbane were hammered in that game, but they feel like a different team. And Geelong are a different team as well. In fact, both are. Brisbane have got about 8 new faces from that game, whilst the Cats have got a half a dozen as well. Game style is interesting. Game style is interesting in this one. So Brisbane like to generate uncontested marks. They're great at using the width of the Gabba to get some little pockets of space. Zorko's a great short kick. You've got guys like Lockie Neal, like McCluggage, who kick the ball really well. They find little pockets of space to keep building up the ball, to keep finding some uncontested marks so they can get the ball in their half and keep the ball in their half with that great forward line that they've got. Chris Scott knows that. The Geelong players know that. Now, the MCG is bigger, which is harder to defend and easier to bring and find some uncontested marks. But with the pressure of a prelim final, will the Lions go after that? Because in the semi-final, the Giants took away their uncontested mark game, but they were able to find a way. They got down and played a more chaotic style of football. And finally, eventually, only just, they're able to bring themselves back and get the job done. So the game style battle is going to be fascinating. Is the game played how Geelong want it to be played, which is very stable behind the ball, but still willing to give the forwards and the high half forwards opportunities to be creative and hit the scoreboard? Or will it be Brisbane's game? And I think the magic number here is 110. If Brisbane take more than 110 marks, I'm thinking they probably win the game. If they take 100 or less, I think you can be pretty confident that Geelong win this game of footy. So that might be something worth tracking as the game goes along. Just to give you an idea, now the scoreboard's number one, and it's the most important, but just to give you an idea of how this game is playing out, how the game is shaping up, because occasionally the scoreboard can tell you a bit of a lie. It can be more about how the game is playing itself out. So if Brisbane have got 65 marks at half time, but are down by 2 goals, I'd be really confident they can win the game. But it's going to be really interesting. It's going to be about adjustments. 2 teams which do make great adjustments, particularly the Cats with Chris Scott. From a selection perspective, I'm almost certain Tom Hawkins won't play. I'm very certain Cam Guthrie won't play. And I actually struggle to see them bringing back Sam De Koning. So Tom Stewart comes in, which means a Shane Mullen, who I'd love to keep in the 22 to potentially go to Lockie Neal. Stewart comes in for Mullen. Basically, every other Geelong player demands a place in that 22. Jed Buse is needed for Charlie Cameron, and unless they were to go and give Zach Guthrie the role. But I think everyone else demands a place, demands a position in that 22. So I'm thinking De Koning, Hawkins, and Guthrie all miss out, and they'll be reliant on suspension, injury, or a poor game from someone to win themselves a spot in a grand final if they have to happen to make it that far. It's a good problem to have, but I'm telling you now, having sat in a few of those types of meetings, that match committee, that selection meeting will be a long one. I'm going the upset. I picked them at the start of 2024. In fact, I picked them last year. There's no point jumping off the Lions now. I'm saying Brisbane by 3 points, which means I've got a Brisbane-Sydney grand final. No good for the traditional VFL lovers, but good for the game. It'll be a ripping AFL grand final. You get people travelling down from up north. The Sydney siders would arrive. The South Melbourne supporters would be here. And the Brisbane and Fitzroy supporters would arrive en masse as well. Prelim final weekend, it's the one they tell us is for the purists. The best weekend of footy. Well, I'll tell you what, if it's going to be the best weekend of footy and it's going to live up to last week, it'd want to be good. Can't wait for it. You can see it all live on Channel 7. Thanks for those who are watching. Make sure you check out the NFL podcast in audio format only. And those who have been subscribed to the YouTube channel, I thank you very, very much. And we'll see you in the lead up to the 2024 AFL Grand Final.